Hello everybody, how's it doing? It's time for more Tales from the Creeps. I don't know why I decided a motorboat there. Anyway. Oh my gosh, I'm autistic. Anyway, this week's story we'll have two stories again by the same author, because they're both short and kind of sweet to the point. I haven't read them yet, but I've looked at the length of it, and they're both pretty short. Anyway, our author today is Acrobatic Big 4780, and he allowed me to read some of his stories when I posted on the Reddit, just suggesting stuff. So, thank you to the author for letting me read his stories. And the first one we're going to look at today is called The Spaces Between the Letters. Just the title alone sounded really interesting, and it's an extra horror. Like always, I have not looked into this, I haven't read it yet, so I usually go blind so y'all can have my genuine reaction to the things. So, and then the next one. Oh, what's the next one? What's the next one? Let me look. Is shoot, where'd he go? Architect of Abominations. So I'm going to read those both one after the other, and then I'll review them both after I've read them. So anyway, without further ado, the spaces between the letters. So this story has chapters in it, or sections. This is chapter 1, The Fortress of the Mundane. My life was not merely quiet. It was an architecture of the expected, a fortress of the tactical. I found a profane, almost religious comfort in the friction of the physical world. Every morning at 6:15 a.m., the radiator in my high street apartment would begin in performance. A series of rhythmic, metallic clanks that sounded like a clockwork heart beating with the chest of an iron giant. I would lie there for exactly 3 minutes, letting the heat rise, grounding myself in the scent of dry dust and old floor wax. My kitchen was in a sanctuary of the predictable. I took a perverse measure. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry. I took a perverse pleasure in the weight of my cast iron kettle, the handle worn smooth by 20 years of the same grip. I would measure out my loose leaf Earl Grey with a silver spoon that had belonged to my grandfather, watching the black curls hit the bottom of the porcelain with a soft, dry rattle of dead crickets. I brewed it at precisely 98 degrees Celsius, never a degree higher. I would watch the surface as it cooled, a thin, iridescent pellicule forming on the top, a microscopic film of tannins and calcium that shimmered like oil. I would use my starch badger hairbrush to meticulously skim the film away, a morning ritual of purification. I was a man of the grain, the fiber, and the stitch. I loved the scratch of my tweed jacket against my neck, and the way my leather satchel groaned under the weight of my grading rubrics. It sounded dependable and honest as the creak of a ship's hull in a steady harbor. To me, the real world was something you could touch, something that resisted you. I believed that as long as I could feel the gift of the stone wall or the sharp edge of a page, I was safe. I had no idea that my reality was as brittle and illusionary as the shimmering pellicle of the tea surface waiting for a single heavy thumb to break the tension and reveal the endless, stagnant blackness beneath. Really flowery really flowery writing, and like a lot of heavy words are used, and it's pretty neat. I like it. Alright, Chapter 2, The Visitor, Dr. Vane's Descent. The change did not begin with a glitch, it began with a knock. It was 11:42 p.m. on a Tuesday. I was in my study, the low hum of my magnifying lamp, the only sound in the apartment, when a frantic, uneven thudding struck my oak door. It wasn't the polite rap of a colleague, it was the sound of someone trying to beat their way out of a coffin. When I opened it, Dr. Vane stood on my landing. He was unrecognizable. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie was missing, and he was drenched in sweat that smelled like old copper and wet electricity. He was clutching a heavy wooden crate bound in iron chains that sang a frantic metallic song, like a choir of cicadas screaming in a language made of rust wire. Arthur! Arthur, he wheezed, his eyes darting toward the dark corners of the hallways as if shadows were growing teeth. He wasn't looking at me, he was looking past me, checking the dimensions of my reality. You're the only one who can stabilize it. You have to have the hands for it, the patience. Vane, you're hyperventilating. Come in, let me get the kettle started. No! He recoiled as if suggestive of domestic comfort or a physical blow. His hands were shaking so violently that the crate rattled his grip. Just don't read the margins. For the love of God, Arthur, keep your eyes on the primary text. If you look at the gaps look back. He practically shoved the crate into my arms. It was unnaturally heavy, as if the wood were filled with lead or gathered gravity. As her fingers brushed, I felt a static discharge so sharp it drew blood from my thumb. Vane didn't even flinch. He just backed away into the dimly lit corridor, his breath coming in ragged and wet gasps. "It's a census, Arthur," he whispered, his voice sounding hollow as if it were echoing from the bottom of a deep, dry well. "It's counting on us, and it's almost finished." He vanished into the night, leaving me alone with the crate. I carried it into my study, and as I sat down on my pristine workbench, my cat Horace didn't just hiss. He bolted from the room and hid under the sofa, refusing to come out for 3 days. Chapter 3. The Vault. Fisher's first reading. The Apollyon Folio sat in the climate-controlled vault of the Special Collection basement for 7 days before the lecture. Dr. Fisher, my closest colleague, had volunteered for the initial catalog. On the third day, I found him in the vault at 3 a.m. The air was sterile, kept at a constant 18 Celsius, but it felt thick and heavy, like the atmosphere of a room where 1,000 people had just stopped breathing at once. Fisher wasn't using his protective gloves. He was hunched over the folio, his face so close to the parchment that his breath was fogging in the ink, creating a damp mist that seemed to make the letters squirm. "Fisher, the oils from your skin," I began. He didn't look up. His eyes were vibrating in their sockets, moving with frantic mechanical precision of a sewing machine needle. "The notes, Arthur," he whispered. His voice had a strange metallic wetness to it, sounding like a handful of coins being stirred in a bowl of heavy cream. "The scribe was writing a story. He was drawing a map of the gap between our atoms. If you read the gaps, the world stopped being solid." He turned to me, and then I recoiled. His skin looked translucent, like a sheet of vellum that had been soaked in oil until you could see the shadow of his bones moving on the other side. There was a rhythmic, violent pulsing in his neck that looked like a trapped bird trying to peck its way out of a throat. Ew. Oh, that's unnerving. He had seen the census, he had seen the list of names being crossed out in black, oily ink, and he had realized his own name was a typo waiting to be corrected. Chapter 4. The Architecture of the Scream. The morning of the lecture, the university felt brittle, as if the buildings were made of sugar glass. I stood at the lectern in Hall 4B, the wood feeling thin and hollow beneath my palms, like the dried-out shell of a cicada, waiting for a heavy wind to turn into dust. Fisher stood by the projector, his fingers dancing against the keys with frantic, mindless rhythm of a centipede's legs being scorched by a magnifying glass. "The Apollyon Folio," I began, my voice echoing with a hollow metallic ring. I clicked the remote. The projector light didn't just flicker, it bruised, turning a sickly, deep violet, the color of crushed plum, left to rot in the corner of an empty cathedral. "Look at the first plate, the Legion of Mandibles." I turned to Fisher. He was finally unfolding. His jaw slid down to his chest, the skin stretching like wet taffy pulled between the fingers of a bored child. His eyes were gone, replacing by shimmering binary static that churned like a swarm of black flies over a digital corpse. His ruined throat erupted of a polyphonic roar, a screech of primeval data that sounded like 1,000 glass violins being crushed slowly in the jaws of a hydraulic press. Chapter 5. The Legion. Anatomical Catastrophes. I fled the hall, but the Legion was already in the walls. These were not demons of fire and sulfur. They were anatomical catastrophes rendered in obsidian and liquid oil. Up close, the creatures were a terrifying mockery of human form. Their bodies were composed of thousands of interlocking human fingers, pale, wrinkled, and twitching, fused together to form long, multiple-jointed appendages. These limbs moved with sickening, oily fluidity of a black snake drowning in a jar of warm honey. They possessed no muscular system I recognized. Instead, they moved through a process of rapid biological reorganization. As they skittered, you could hear the faint, wet clicking of thousands of fingernails, tapping against the floor like a hailstorm of mad bone. The mandibles were the true horror. Each creature lacked a face, posing instead of a vertical rift that ran the length of its torso. Within this rift were hundreds of calcified human jaws, stacked like the teeth of a shark, vibrating with a low, grinding sound like a meat grinder, filled with porcelain shards that didn't walk. They undulated. Their finger limbs skittered across the floorboards with a sound like a million dry autumn leaves being blown across the fresh grave. They were the cleanup crew of the census. Their maws exhaled the smell of burnt hair and ozone as they ground the physical matter of the world. The chairs, the bricks, the students, into a fine gray data sludge. When one brushed against a wooden desk, the grain of the wood didn't splinter. and unraveled into a black binary smoke as if the Legion were reclaiming the ink that had been used to draw the furniture in the first place. Chapter 6, The Skin Suit and the Second Vein. Alright, I want to get a drink real quick, hold on. Whew, okay. I found Vane in the faculty lounge. He sat perfectly still, holding a cup of tea that was perfectly motionless, like a puck of brown glass. As the sun hit his neck, I saw the seams. The skin was bunched up around his collar, thick and gray, fitting his frame with an awkward heavy sag of a wet winter coat, draped over a pile of broken umbrellas. "Thinking he has to go somewhere, Arthur," he said, his voice sounding like a dry rattle of dead leaves being blown across a marble tomb. He reached out to touch the table, and the wood pixelated into a black squares that drifted through the air like soot from a burning library. Chapter 7, The Unzipping and the Void. I bolted back to my apartment, locking every bolt, but the smell was already there, crushed ozone and ancient sterile gold. Behind my headboard was the wallpaper of bruising. A damp, circular patch began to spread, the floral patterns curling back like the edges of a photograph being held too close to a candle. I touched it. It was frictionless. It felt like reaching into the throat of a god who had forgotten how to breathe. The room unzipped, with a sound like a heavy silk gown being shredded by a dull blade. The wall opened, the legion of mandibles, skittering on the thousands of fused fingers, lashed out from the shivering static. They wrapped around my torso, their cold, pale grip feeling like liquid nitrogen. I watched the horror as my own fingers began to twitch in rhythm with theirs, my skin turning the color of a wet parchment. They began to fuse, my knuckles merging into the single, continuous rod of bone. I was being read into the Legion. They yanked me through the gap like a loose thread being pulled from a cheap, unraveling sweater. Chapter 8, The Beautiful Adversary. The Final Margin. Oh my gosh. This is hitting all, like, the demonic, like, flowery language that the Bible has said. It's kind of neat. Like, the adversary is what's used in the Bible, like an enemy or just the opposite. It's really cool. I landed in the archive, a shelf of calcified grief. Before me stood the adversary, a geometric horror of shifting gold leaf and wet ink that looked like the shadow of a four-dimensional spider being cast into the back of my own retinas. The adversary was the architect of the Legion, the one who had composed the mandibles from the discarded parts of previous drafts. "You have the Margellina, Arthur," the adversary whispered. The voice wasn't sound, but a vibration in my marrow that felt like a violin string being pulled until it cut through the wood of the instrument. I pulled out the badger hair brush. It was pathetic, small thing. I tried to paint my bedroom back, the clink of the radiator, the scratch of my tweeded jacket, the shimmering pellicle of my tea, but the adversary simply tilted its shifting golden head. My apartment flacked away like dried, cheap paint. The florist on the corner, the rain, the taste of the tea, it all melted away like a sugar cube being dropped into a cup of boiling acid. The archive is closing. The ink is dry. I'm being erased as my conscious mind begins to pixelate. I see the adversary reach out of my hand of pure, shimmering vellum, picks up a pen made of stars, dying light, and prepares to write the first letter of a new, terrifying, perfect reality on the blank white space where my life used to be. The last sound is like the slamming of a vault door in an empty universe. Chapter 9, The Silence. The radiator has stopped clinking. The smell of Earl Grey has been edited out. Even as you read this, notice the weight of the device in your hand, or the texture of the chair beneath you. It feels solid, doesn't it? Just as Arthur's silver spoon felt solid. Just as Dr. Vane's skin once felt warm. But remember, the adversary does not stop at the last page. It simply waits for the reader to look at the gaps between the letters. As if you finish the sentence, you might wonder if the static in your own vision is just tiredness, or if the ink of your own life is beginning to run. Arthur Penhaligon is gone. The page is blank. The silence is yours now. Theron Thomas was an architect of the mind, a man for whom the greatest blueprints were drawn not on paper, but in the silent, boundless cathedral of his own thoughts. His imagination was a tool of exquisite precision, crafting palaces of obsidian and gardens of crystalline dew. He considered it his greatest gift, a private sanctuary from the mundane world of steel and glass. But sanctuary, he would come to learn, is merely another word for a cage. The change began subtly. A stray thought, a fleeting daydream of a spiral staircase carved from a single piece of malachite, would solidify into a fleeting shimmer at the corner of his vision. At first, it was beautiful, a testament to the vividness of his inner world. He began to indulge it, to chasing the sensation, and soon the phantasms of his mind were no longer transient. A perfect blood-red rose, imagined with every velvet petal and sharp thorn, materialized on his nightstand. It sent a perfume of impossible depth. A few days later, a complex looping melody he had been composing in his head began to hum from the pipes in his apartment, a sound both harmonious and deeply alien. The rose never wilted. The melody never faded. The boundary between thought and reality was dissolving, and Theron, in his hubris, believed he was its master. He saw himself as a god in the making, a singular creative force. He crafted a tiny, perfect clockwork bird of pure silver that perched on his finger and chirped with the sound of a distant star. He willed into existence a small, intricate key, the teeth of which formed the constellations of the zodiac, and sat on his desk, not knowing what lock it was meant to open. But a limitless imagination is not a single, clean reservoir of thought. It is a churning ocean of potential, holding not only a beauty, but also the deep-sea abominations that lurk beneath the surface of consciousness. The first sense of the grotesque came in the key. The silver began to shift and bleed, its surface rippling like disturbed water, the constellation teeth elongated and twisted, morphing into tiny skeletal fingers that quivered in the air. The perfect clockwork bird's silver plumage began to fray and peel away, revealing not metal, but a lattice of pulsing veins and pallid muscle. Its chirps turned to a wet, gurgled chittering. Theron, in a moment of sheer terror, willed them to disappear. He thought of nothingness, of non-existence, but the concepts were weak and amorphous. The key simply clutched itself into a tighter, more knot-like shape, and the bird flew into a dark corner of the room, where it began to meticulously pluck its own exposed flesh. The floodgates had opened. His imagination was no longer a personal garden, but a cosmic sewer, spewing forth the warped, half-formed thoughts that had always existed in the dark. Forgotten corners of his mind, he tried to think of simple things, a chair, a cup of coffee, but they emerged from the ether as monstrous mockeries. The chair's legs were jointed like an insect's, its cushion woven from the stiff black hair. The coffee cup was slick and gelatinous, its surface staring back at him with 100 unblinking eyes. Sleep became impossible. The dreams he tried to suppress during the day manifested as living nightmares in his apartment. Walls oozed a foul, greasy ichor that reformed into murals of screaming faces. The floor tiles began to undulate and rearrange themselves into impossible geometries that hurt to look at. From the very air, a creature of pure, formless shadow coalesced in its shape, a negative space, a void that devoured light and sound, whispering forgotten names in a tongue of wet clicks and grinding teeth. He ran, but his imagination was a sickness that followed him. Every time a new thought of terror or revulsion broke through, it became real. He saw a man on the street and fleetingly imagined his bones on the outside, a ghastly reverse skeleton. A moment later, a figure stumbled past his skin, translucent, his eternal skeleton, a cage of jagged, exposed bone. Theron screamed, and the sound of his own terror became the flock of needle-beaked birds that swirled and doved around his head, their cries sounding like shattering glass. Theron realized that his imagination had never been his own. It was a lock, and the key he had created was the only one that it opened. He had tapped into something older than thought, a sentient, formless chaos that used human minds as creative engines to craft its abominations into reality. He was not a god, he was a host. He sat in the center of the street, amidst the shrieking bone-caged figures and the chittering silver birds, and tried to think of a simpler, beautiful sunset. The sky above him began to tear not into clouds, but into strips of raw, pulsing meat. And from the rents, a crimson light poured forth, not from a star, but from a single, vast, and lidless eye. His imagination, a tool he had considered a gift, was limitless as horror. It was its final, most grotesque work. He closed his eyes and began to scream, but the sound that came out of it was wet, clicking chitter, and he felt his bones begin to rearrange themselves inside his skin. And that was the end of our two stories. The Space Between the Letters and Architect of Abomination. This author has such a way with like flowery lettering and like wording. It's really cool, like the visuals he can put in your head, and how like in the the space between the letters, how it was like kind of like inspiration for like the devil from the Bible and how he would come to light through like technology and not through other means like you would think he would, like rituals and stuff like that, but more technological stuff. And then in the Architect of Abominations, this guy was like so deep in his own mind that he thought he could control everything, but he really just gained the attention of some kind of eldritch being that was manipulating him into some kind of host. It's so sick, man. I love both of those stories. They were so cool. So that's all I have to say for those. So thank you again for letting me read your stories. I really appreciate it. I hope you keep writing. You will only get better. Not them saying it's bad, but that's just something I like to say to encourage writers and authors that I've read from. So you can only get better if you keep it up. So that's all I have for tonight. You all have a great night. Okay. Later.